She marched up to him, phone in hand, ready to call the police until he calmly said 10 words that froze her blood. I'm the regional vice president of this entire company. The morning sun had just begun to rise over the city skyline, casting golden rays across the sleek glass building of Garrison Enterprises. Employees filtered into the parking lot with coffee in hand and determination in their eyes, each preparing for another day at the office. Among them was Marcus Taylor, a tall, poised black man dressed in a tailored navy blue suit. His calm demeanor, confident stride and leather briefcase made him look like someone important because he was. Marcus wasn't just another employee. He was the newly appointed regional vice president, visiting this branch for a surprise check-in and a leadership meeting. Though his position was powerful, Marcus had learned long ago to never assume he would be recognized, especially by people who didn't expect a man like him to be in a role like his. He approached the entrance of the building with his keycard in one hand and a hot cup of black coffee in the other. As he reached the front glass doors, a sharp voice called out from behind him, "Hey, excuse me, you can't go in there." Marcus turned around to see a white woman hurrying toward him, phone clutched tightly in her hand, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. She was in her mid-40s, dressed in a tight blazer with her ID badge swinging from a lanyard around her neck that read Karen Whitman, executive assistant. Her heels clicked rapidly on the pavement as she got closer, her jaw tight, her stare sharp. "Yes?" Marcus asked politely, puzzled but calm. "This parking lot and building are for employees only," Karen said flatly, crossing her arms. "You need to leave before I call security." Marcus raised an eyebrow, confused but composed. "I am an employee. I'm here for a leadership meeting." Karen's eyes flicked to his suit, then to his skin, and back again. Her mouth twisted slightly, as if she didn't believe a word of it. "I've never seen you here before," she said, "and I know everyone in management." Marcus took a slow breath, still keeping his tone polite. "That's because I don't work in this building regularly. I oversee several branches, including this one." Her eyes narrowed even more. "You'll need to show me some ID." Marcus gave a half smile, still calm but now visibly amused. "And who are you, exactly?" "I'm Mr. Langston's executive assistant," she replied proudly, "and I don't let strangers walk into this building without verifying who they are." Marcus reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his company badge, clearly marked with his name, title, and photo. "Marcus Taylor, regional vice president." He held it up for her to see, but Karen snatched it from his hand and inspected it like it was a counterfeit dollar bill. "This says you're a VP," she said, laughing nervously. "You expect me to believe that?" Before Marcus could respond, a car pulled into the parking lot. A sleek black SUV. Van out jumped a man in his early 50s, dressed in a gray suit, clearly flustered and rushing. "Mr. Taylor," he called out breathlessly. "I'm so sorry, I'm late. Traffic was insane this morning." Marcus nodded with a small, patient smile. "No problem, Mr. Langston. I was just getting acquainted with your team." Mr. Langston's smile froze when he looked between Marcus and Karen. "Wait, what happened here?" Karen's face had gone pale, her mouth open but no words coming out. She stammered, I thought he didn't look like Mr. Langston." Turned to her, eyebrows raised in confusion and growing concern. "Karen, this is Mr. Marcus Taylor. He's our regional vice president. He oversees this branch and 6 others." The silence between them thickened. Karen's hand slowly lowered the badge. She looked at Marcus, visibly mortified, her expression collapsing, from arrogance to embarrassment in a matter of seconds. I didn't realize. I'm so sorry." Marcus took his badge back with a polite nod. "No harm done," he said evenly. "Though it's probably worth revisiting how we handle unfamiliar faces around here." Mr. Langston nodded, his tone now serious. "Absolutely. We'll discuss it in today's leadership meeting." Karen stepped back quietly, her eyes burning with shame. She had made a snap judgment, a dangerous one, and now the entire company was about to hear about it. As Marcus followed Mr. Langston into the building, employees greeted him with respectful nods, some of them unaware of what had just happened outside. But for Karen, the moment had already etched itself deep into her conscience. She stood rooted to the spot, her thoughts racing. It wasn't just the embarrassment of mistaking a regional VP for a trespasser. It was the deeper truth she couldn't ignore, that her own assumptions, unconscious or not, had driven her to confront a man who had done absolutely nothing wrong. And now, nothing in her work life would ever be quite the same again. The next morning, the office buzzed with quiet tension. Whispers traveled quickly through cubicles and break rooms like an invisible current. Everyone had heard about the incident in the parking lot. No one had all the details, but the pieces were falling into place. A senior executive wrongly confronted an executive assistant making assumptions, and a highly respected vice president who remained calm while being challenged where he should have been welcomed. Karen Whitman sat at her desk with a stone in her stomach. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Marcus Taylor's calm, measured expression as she stood in front of him, full of false confidence and quiet bias. Her computer screen glowed blankly in front of her, but her hands hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to type. Around her co-workers kept their eyes busy, avoiding hers. The normal rhythm of the office had been disrupted, like a song that had hit a wrong note and couldn't quite recover. Karen knew she had made a huge mistake, but what unsettled her more was how easily it had happened. She hadn't yelled, she hadn't cursed, but she had judged instantly, automatically, and she had acted on it without question. She tried to focus on her emails, but her fingers trembled slightly. Her pride wanted to believe it had been a misunderstanding. Maybe she was just being cautious, right? But the deeper part of her, the part she couldn't ignore anymore, knew the truth. If Marcus had looked different, if he had been a white man in the same suit, she would have welcomed him, asked if he needed help, offered to show him around. Instead, she saw him as a threat. That realization sat heavy in her chest. In the boardroom down the hall, the leadership meeting was in full swing. Marcus sat at the head of the table, surrounded by senior managers from different departments. His voice was calm but firm as he laid out quarterly goals and performance targets. The conversation was sharp and focused, yet underneath the numbers and planning, something else hung in the air. Everyone knew what had happened yesterday. Even if Marcus hadn't mentioned it, they could feel it, and it made them uncomfortable. At one point, Mr. Langston brought up employee engagement and company culture, and that's when Marcus finally spoke about it without naming names, without placing blame. "There's something we all need to think about," he said, folding his hands on the table. "Culture isn't just about mission statements and dress codes. It's about how we treat people, especially those we don't recognize or expect. If our environment allows assumptions to guide behavior, then something's broken." The room was quiet. A few people shifted in their seats. No one dared interrupt. Marcus continued. "Bias, whether conscious or unconscious, shows up in the smallest moments. A look, a question, a challenge that wouldn't have been made to someone else. It's not enough to avoid being outwardly disrespectful. We need to create a space where everyone is given the benefit of the doubt, where professionalism isn't measured by someone's face or background." Heads nodded, some slowly, some with guilt. Mr. Langston cleared his throat and added, "I think it's time we bring back the inclusion training, not just for compliance, but to change how we see each other." Karen overheard that part from outside the boardroom. Her chest tightened. She didn't need to be told she had triggered this change. She already knew. But maybe, she thought, that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe it needed to happen, even if it had to start with her embarrassment. Later that afternoon, Karen stood outside Marcus's temporary office, heart pounding, unsure whether she had the right to knock. But after a deep breath and a silent apology to her own ego, she tapped gently. "Come in," came Marcus's voice. She stepped inside, hands clasped nervously. "Mr. Taylor, may I have a moment?" He looked up from his laptop, expression unreadable. "Of course, Ms. Whitman." She closed the door behind her and stood awkwardly. "I want to say I'm sorry, not just for how I treated you in the parking lot, but for what it meant. I acted on an assumption I didn't even realize I had. I disrespected you, and worse, I didn't even stop to question myself. That's not who I want to be." Marcus studied her face, looking not for guilt, but for sincerity. After a pause, he nodded. "I appreciate that, Karen. It takes something to admit that out loud." She looked down. "I know an apology doesn't fix everything, but I want to learn. I want to understand how I let something like that happen so easily." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his voice gentle but steady. "We all have blind spots. What matters is whether we let them define us or whether we confront them. Growth doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from being honest." Karen nodded, eyes welling with quiet emotion. "Thank you," she said softly, before excusing herself. As she left the room, the air felt a little lighter. Her shame hadn't disappeared, but it had changed shape, no longer a weight pressing down on her, but a challenge urging her to do better. The ripple she caused had started uncomfortable conversations. It had made people look inward. And for the first time in a long while, Karen felt like she was finally ready to listen. The following days brought a quiet shift in the atmosphere at Garrison Enterprises. Not everyone spoke openly about what had happened, but nearly everyone thought about it. The incident in the parking lot had lit a silent fire beneath the surface, exposing questions people often avoided. What assumptions do we carry into work with us? How many times had someone been wrongly judged, dismissed, or overlooked because of who they were or how they looked? In break rooms and lunch tables, small groups gathered in low voices. Some were empathetic, some defensive, and some uncertain. It was just a misunderstanding. One manager whispered to another. She probably thought she was protecting the office, but others responded more thoughtfully, even if she meant well. That's the problem. You shouldn't have to look a certain way to be seen as belonging. The conversations weren't always comfortable, but they were happening, and that alone marked a change. Meanwhile, Karen found herself walking through the building with new eyes. She had always prided herself on being polite, efficient, and organized. She believed she treated everyone with equal respect. But now, she questioned her past behavior. Had she ever cut off a colleague mid-sentence without realizing? Had she ever ignored someone's ideas in a meeting because they didn't seem experienced? The truth unsettled her. Maybe this wasn't the first time she'd acted on hidden bias. Maybe it was just the first time someone had caught her doing it. One afternoon, Karen stepped into the HR office, clutching a small notebook and a nervous heart. "Do you have a few minutes?" she asked Lila, the HR director. Lila, a black woman in her late 30s with kind eyes and an air of quiet authority, nodded. "Of course," she said. "Come in." Karen sat down across from her, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "I want to talk about what happened with Mr. Taylor. I'm not here to defend myself. I want to understand more. I want to be better." Lila raised her eyebrows slightly, surprised but not unimpressed. "That's a good place to start. Not many people come in here voluntarily after something like that. I've been reading about unconscious bias," Karen continued, "and microaggressions. I didn't even know that word before this week, but I've seen examples now, things I've probably said or done without thinking." Lila nodded slowly. "We all have blind spots. The difference is whether we're willing to confront them. Most people stay in denial because it's easier. You're choosing to look inward, and that takes courage." Karen exhaled deeply, grateful and ashamed at the same time. "I don't want this to be about saving face. I want to actually change. If there's anything I can do, books to read, people to listen to, I'll do it." Lila smiled gently. "I'll send you a few resources, and we'll be rolling out the inclusion workshop next month. But real change happens in the small, everyday moments. Be present, be humble, ask questions, and most of all, listen." Outside the HR office, Marcus continued his work as regional VP without missing a beat. He was used to juggling executive decisions, data reports, and team evaluations. But this time, something personal had followed him into the job. He didn't seek to punish Karen. He didn't even want her gone. What he wanted was bigger than one apology. It was a shift in culture, a lesson that echoed beyond the office walls. In the days following their brief conversation, Marcus began having quiet, intentional meetings with team leaders, not to bring up the incident directly, but to talk about inclusion, workplace empathy, and how leadership needed to reflect not just skills but emotional awareness. He spoke about how diversity wasn't just about hiring more people of color, it was about how those people were treated once they were in the room. Were their voices heard? Were they supported? Or were they watched, questioned, and second-guessed? In one such meeting, a manager named Daniel admitted something that surprised even himself. "To be honest," he said, "I've had moments where I judged people without meaning to, based on how they dressed, how they spoke. I'd never call it racism, but maybe that's the problem. We only recognize the extreme stuff. We ignore the quiet ways we cause harm." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That's where change begins, with honesty, not just pointing fingers at others, but holding a mirror to ourselves." That night, Karen sat on her living room couch, laptop open, surrounded by sticky notes and articles. Her mind raced with stories of people who had been profiled, dismissed, or ignored in places they were supposed to feel safe. She read one article that struck her hard. A young black man had been mistaken for a janitor in his own tech firm, despite being a lead engineer. Karen swallowed the knot in her throat. That could have been Marcus. That was Marcus in a different form. She opened her notebook and wrote a line she'd heard Lila say: "Be present, be humble, listen." She underlined it twice, not to memorize, but to remind herself this wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about transforming who she was on the inside. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was becoming someone worth listening to. 2 weeks later, the company-wide inclusion training began. It wasn't the standard slideshow presentation people were used to. There were no corny stock photos or robotic lectures. Instead, the company had brought in a respected diversity consultant, Maya Grant, who had spent years helping organizations see the hidden layers of their workplace culture. The room was full, but the energy was cautious. Employees sat in rows of chairs, clutching notepads, exchanging polite small talk, unsure of what was coming or how uncomfortable it might get. Karen sat near the back, eyes fixed on the floor as people filed in. She had been dreading this moment, not because she didn't want to be there, but because she feared how people would look at her. She was sure they knew, maybe not every detail, but enough to make assumptions of their own. She tried not to let it show. This time, she was there to listen, not to defend. Marcus entered quietly and took a seat in the front. He didn't make a show of being there, but his presence was undeniable. Everyone noticed and everyone knew why it mattered. It wasn't often that a high-ranking executive sat in on these sessions, but Marcus had made it clear this wasn't optional, and it wasn't performative. It was personal. Maya began by telling a story not about policies or workplace violations, but about her father, a black man who spent 30 years working at a company where people called him the help, even after he became department head. Bias, she said, doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, and the people who hear it most clearly are the ones most used to being ignored. The room went still. Her words didn't accuse, but they cut through every wall people had built to protect their comfort. She moved into exercises. One of them asked employees to write down a moment they felt othered, out of place, unwelcome, unseen. Then she asked them to write down a time they might have made someone else feel that way, even unintentionally. Karen stared at her blank paper, the pen in her hand feeling heavier than it should. The first part was easy. She thought of being the only woman in a tech-heavy meeting, talked over and interrupted. She scribbled it down. The second part took longer. Her mind instantly went back to the parking lot. Of course. But then came other flashes, times she had made a sarcastic joke about someone's accent, dismissed a suggestion from a quieter co-worker, or assumed someone was in an assistant role just because they looked young. These weren't crimes, but they weren't harmless either. She began to understand that bias didn't always need to be cruel to be real. Maya asked for volunteers to share, and at first the room was silent. Then a man from accounting stood up and said, "I once asked the only Muslim guy on our team if he was allowed to celebrate Christmas. I thought I was just being friendly." But the look on his face, I realized I had reduced him to one part of his identity. A few heads nodded slowly. The tension in the room softened a little, like air being let out of a balloon. Karen surprised herself by raising her hand. Her voice trembled a little as she spoke. "I judged someone in the worst way possible. I assumed they didn't belong, just based on appearance. I didn't ask questions. I didn't give the benefit of the doubt. I just acted, and I hurt someone who deserved better. I've spent every day since trying to understand why I reacted that way. I still don't have a perfect answer, but I know this: if we don't face our assumptions, we can't grow past them." The room was silent, but not cold. Maya gave her a small nod of respect. "Owning it," she said, "is the beginning of changing it." Marcus glanced back, not with scorn, but with quiet acknowledgement. Karen wasn't looking for approval. She didn't feel entitled to it, but the look in his eyes told her one thing: she was on the right path. After the session, the air in the office felt different. It was subtle but real. People paused more. Before speaking, they listened more. They questioned their own reactions. It wasn't perfection, it was progress. In the break room, Karen found herself talking to colleagues she had never connected with before, not out of guilt, but curiosity. She asked about their backgrounds, their stories, their lives outside the office. And when she listened, she truly listened. Not with her mouth half open waiting to reply, but with openness, with the awareness that everyone carries something we don't see at first glance. Marcus continued to lead by example. He mentored younger staff, encouraged diverse hiring, and pushed for better representation in every department. But he also made it clear, this wasn't about numbers. It was about presence, power, and dignity. One day after work, Karen passed by Marcus's office and stopped. The door was slightly open. She knocked gently. "I just wanted to say thank you, not just for how you handled everything, but for giving us the chance to learn from it. You didn't have to." Marcus looked up, smiling faintly. "You're right. I didn't have to, but if we shut people out every time they mess up, no one learns anything. Growth takes patience. For everyone." She nodded. "I'm learning that." Slowly, he leaned back in his chair. "Good. Keep going." As she walked away, Karen realized something she hadn't before. Redemption isn't about forgetting what you did. It's about facing it, learning from it, and using it to become better than you were. And that journey, hard, messy, and honest, was just beginning. The final days of the quarter brought a kind of calm to Garrison Enterprises, a quiet that came not from stillness, but from reflection. It had been almost 2 months since the morning that had set everything into motion, and the aftershocks. We had finally settled. The office no longer buzzed with gossip or secondhand stories about what Karen had done. Instead, something deeper had taken root. Conversations that once skimmed the surface now dipped into honesty. Colleagues checked their assumptions, asked better questions, and looked each other in the eyes with a little more understanding. No one pretended the company had become perfect overnight, but something had shifted. A seed had been planted. Karen felt the difference most in herself. Each day she arrived not just as the executive assistant who kept schedules running and meetings smooth, but as someone who had been cracked open and stitched back together with purpose. The embarrassment, the guilt, the sick feeling she'd once carried, those emotions hadn't disappeared, but they had transformed into something more useful. Now when she looked at people, especially those who didn't look like her, she didn't rush to conclusions. She paused. She considered. She learned. That morning, she had one last task to complete: preparing the conference room for Marcus Taylor's final regional meeting of the quarter. He would be returning to headquarters soon, and this would be his last visit to their branch office for a while. Karen moved through the room with practiced grace, setting out folders, checking the coffee, adjusting the chairs. But this time, every small action held meaning. This was the room where Marcus had once addressed a group of tense managers with calm authority, talking about bias not as a buzzword but as a lived experience. She remembered how uncomfortable some people had looked, how others avoided eye contact. Now, those same people greeted each other differently in the halls. The meeting began at 10 sharp. Marcus entered the room, greeted with respect and familiarity. The staff was more at ease with him now, not because he had softened, but because they had finally adjusted to the presence of a black executive at the helm. The novelty had faded on, that was the point. He wasn't an exception. He was a leader, and now they saw him for what he was, not what they expected him to be. After the meeting wrapped, Marcus lingered in the room, talking casually with a few department heads. Karen began clearing cups and gathering leftover materials when Marcus turned to her. "Kieran," he said, "can I steal a few minutes?" She looked up startled but nodded. Of course. They stepped into his temporary office and closed the door behind them. It was the first time they'd spoken one-on-one since the mentorship program launched. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, just thoughtful. "I wanted to thank you," Marcus said, "not just for coordinating today, but for the way you've carried yourself since everything happened." Karen looked down briefly, then met his eyes. "I still think about it. Every day." "That's okay," he said. "It means you haven't forgotten the lesson." She sat across from him, her voice steady. "I used to think people either were racist or weren't, good or bad, but I've realized now it's more complicated than that. It's about what's unconscious, what's unspoken, the assumptions we don't even hear ourselves make." Marcus nodded. "And the courage it takes to challenge those things inside ourselves. Most people never do." Karen's eyes misted slightly, but she didn't look away. "I used to think I was the kind of person who got it. I read books, voted the right way, tried to be polite, but that day, I acted like someone who didn't get it at all." "You weren't the first," he said gently, "and you won't be the last. But what you did afterward, that's rare." She exhaled slowly. "You could have reported me, got me fired, made an example out of me." He leaned forward slightly. "That's not what leadership is. Leadership is about recognizing the moment that can change someone, not just punish them, but grow them. And if I had taken the easy road, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Karen gave a small, grateful smile. "You gave me something. Most people never get space to change." Marcus stood, offering his hand. "Just promise me you'll keep paying it forward." She shook his hand firmly. "I already have." That afternoon, as Marcus left the building, a few employees came to the windows to wave. He smiled, nodded, then disappeared into his car. It was a quiet goodbye, but not an ending. His impact remained, not in grand speeches or policy memos, but in how people now walked through the doors with a little more humility, a little more grace. Karen watched from the third floor, hand resting on the glass. She didn't feel ashamed anymore. She felt accountable. There was a difference. One was passive. The other demanded action. Back at her desk, she opened her email and saw a message from a junior associate she had mentored. It simply said, "Thank you for seeing me. Really seeing me." Karen read it twice, then smiled. Sometimes, it only takes one moment to break a pattern, one mistake to open a mind, one decision to change a workplace. And sometimes, it only takes one person willing to face it all and choose something better. That was how change began. And for Karen, it was only the beginning. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to The Black Struggle for more powerful stories that spark change and conversation.